Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting the Deathwatch kill team for Warhammer 40,000 kill team. As you can see, the very first thing I've done is I've sprayed them with some matte black spray from Colourforge. And as sprays never actually hit everywhere you need, I've used some Abaddon black just to tidy things up and to match the spray so everything's a nice uniform colour before we start painting. And to begin the actual painting proper, I'm first going to dry brush all of the armour and the black areas with a little bit of Corvus black. Then I'll be using a second dry brush, but this time it's going to be using Eshin Grey, and it's a much lighter dry brush as we're just trying to pick out the sort of sharper edges and the finer details. The reason why we're keeping it light, like I said, is because it's a very quick and easy way to basically do those sharp edges that you see on more professional models in a more fast and efficient way. I'm then going to start painting their weapons and their tubes with some Mephiston red. The reason why I'm painting the red before I paint the silver is because it's going to be a lot quicker and a lot easier to paint the red before we paint the silver, as most of these weapons also have silver objects on them. And then I'm going to wash the weapons, and only the weapons, with some Nuln Oil. While that wash dries, I'm going to go ahead and start to highlight the pipes and the tubings, first using a 50-50 mix of Mephiston Red and Evil Sunz Scarlet. This will be followed up by Evil Sunz Scarlet just by itself. This is then followed up by a 50-50 mix of Evil Sunz Scarlet and Wild Rider Red. As I want the main weapons, or the main red on the weapons, to be a little bit darker, I'm going to give it a second coat of Nuln Oil. And while that wash dries, I'm going to start to paint the faces. For any white or light-skinned faces, I'm going to be using some Bugman's Glow to begin with. And for any darker skin, I'm going to be using some Catachan Flesh. And we'll stick with the Catachan Flesh to also paint all of the pouches and holsters that are dotted around these miniatures. I'm then going to wash the pouches with some Nuln Oil, while all of the skin receives a wash with some Reichland Flesh Shade. While that wash dries, I'm then going to go back to the guns, and I'm going to be using just the edge of my brush to do a simple edge highlight of Mephiston Red. Once the wash is dried on the pouches, I'm going to go back and I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Catachan Flesh and Knight's Quest of Flesh to start the highlighting process. This will then be followed by Knight's Quest of Flesh just by itself as a quick and simple edge highlight. Now, before we paint any of the faces, I'm going to paint in the eyes. That way, if we make any mistakes, it's a lot easier to tidy up now than it will be later on. To begin with, we're going to use some Abaddon Black to paint these slits. This will be followed by matte white. And then finally, Abaddon Black again for the pupils. So to start highlighting the darker skin, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Catachan Flesh and Blood Reaver Flesh for the first highlight. This will then be followed by Blood Reaver Flesh just by itself. And then finally a 50-50 mix of Blood Reaver Flesh and Knight's Quest of Flesh. If you want the skin to be even a little bit lighter, just continue to use some Knight's Quest of Flesh. Moving over to the lighter skin, I'm going to start with a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone. This will then be followed by Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself. Then finally a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh. I'm then going to use some Screamer Pink to paint the insides of their mouths, along with any hilts of their weapons and the tiny little hilts of the daggers that they carry with them as well. Then I'm going to use a little bit of Pink Horror just to highlight the tongue. And then finally, to finish off the inside of the mouth, I'm going to paint their teeth using a bit of matte white. It's finally time to start painting the silver, and for that I'm going to start with a base coat of Lead Belcher. Then for their weapon attachments and their equipment on their belts, I'm going to be using some Nuln Oil. But for all of the rest of the armor, I'm going to be using a little bit of Drakenhof Nightshade, as we want a small element of blue. And once that wash has dried, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Lead Belcher and Stormhost Silver to start highlighting all of the metal. And this does include both the armor and any of the weapons and equipment. This will be followed up by Stormhost Silver. However, for the armor wall, where there's any sections where there's writing, I'm going to be dry brushing it on instead. And I'm going to stick with that Stormhost Silver, and I'm going to highlight any rivets or bolts that are on the weapons and the armor. Take a lot of care with this section. Use a very small, fine brush, and if you make mistakes, just use any or the appropriate color just to fix that area. To continue with the armor, I'm now going to start painting the gold sections, and for that, I'm going to be using some Retributor armor. I'm also going to paint any other details that I want with this armor, including bolt casings and sort of sections of flamers and things like that. So for the iconography, I'm going to be using some Reichland Flesh Shade. But for the bolt casings and the flamethrower at the front, I'm going to be using some Agrax Earthshade. While that wash dries, I want to move over to painting the purity seals, and for that I'm going to be using some Corn Red. And I'll be giving that a little bit of a wash with some Nuln Oil. Once a wash on the Retributor armor has dried, we're going to go back and use a 50-50 mix of Retributor armor and Uruk Armor Gold to start the highlighting. This will be followed by Uruk Armor Gold just by itself. And then finally, and to help it blend in a little bit with the silver, we're going to be using a 50-50 mix of Uruk Armor Gold and Stormhost Silver. If you want, you can go one step further and add a little bit more Stormhost Silver to make it a little bit more sort of sharper on the edges, but I'm choosing not to do that with these guys. To highlight the purity seals, we're simply going to first relayer the Corn Red. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Corn Red and Wazdaka Red for the one and only highlight. For the rest of the purity seals, we're going to be using some Rakarth Flesh. Before we get to the wash, though, we're going to be using some Morghast Bone to paint the servo skulls that are dotted on a couple of the backpacks. And then we'll wash both the skulls and the purity seals with some Agrax Earthshade. While that wash dries, we'll get the hair out of the way. I'm going to start with sort of reddish hair, and for that I'm simply going to use some Wild Rider Red. Now this is quite a thin coat, so you're going to need at least a couple to get a nice bright colour. For any blonde, I'm going to be using some Wraithbone. Once again, this is quite a light paint, so you will need more than one coat. And then both those colours will be washed with some Agrax Earthshade. For any black hair, I'll be using some Eshin Grey. And for the white hair, I'm going to be using some Grey Seer. Then both the Eshin Grey and the Grey Seer will be washed with some Nuln Oil. By now, the wash on the purity seals should be dry, so we're going to relayer the Rakarth Flesh, making sure we avoid any of the recesses. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Rakarth Flesh and Pallid Witch Flesh. And then finally, just for an edge highlight, I'm going to be using Pallid Witch Flesh just by itself. For the servo skulls, I'm going to relayer with the Morghast Bone, once again taking care to avoid any of the recesses. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Morghast Bone and Wraithbone. Then lastly, Wraithbone just by itself to pick out the more sharper details and the top of the skull. Next, I'm going to start painting any lights or red lights, and for that I'm going to be using a base coat of Mephiston Red. And I'm also going to use it to paint any of the helmeted eyes as well. I'll then use a 50-50 mix of Mephiston Red and Evil Sun Scarlet for the first highlight. And with each highlight getting smaller and smaller and aimed towards the center, the next highlight will be Evil Sun Scarlet just by itself. This will be followed by Wild Rider Red, and then a 50-50 mix of Wild Rider Red and Matte White for the final dot. Any yellow lights will be first base coated with some matte white, and these will be washed with some Cassandora yellow. For any blue lighting, we're going to start with a base coat of Techless Blue. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Techless Blue and Lothern Blue. Then Lothern Blue just by itself. And then finally a 50-50 mix of Lothern Blue and Matte White. Finally, I'm going to be painting some of these screens with green and any leftover buttons, and for that I'm going to be using some Warpstone Glow. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Warpstone Glow and Moot Green. Then Moot Green just by itself. This is more of an edge highlight. Lastly, a 50-50 mix of Moot Green and Matte White, just to kind of dot on the corners or the very sharpest edges. I'm also going to use it to do a little bit of writing on any sort of screens that appear to be open. On the heavier troopers, there's a couple of gauges that need to be painted, so we'll start with a base coat of Corax White. This will then be followed by Matte White just by itself. As pressure gauges generally come with a small sort of section to indicate that it's going too high, so for that I'm going to use a little bit of Mephiston Red. Then finally I'll use a little bit of Abaddon Black to paint the needle of the gauge. So moving on to these shoulder pad sections, this is going to be kind of difficult because, again, we probably don't have the same shoulder pads. So for any blue or lighter blue, I'm going to be using a base coat of Macragge Blue. And this will be followed by a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade. Then any sort of lighter red chapters, I'm going to be starting with some Mephiston Red. And that will be washed with some Agrax Earthshade. I'm going to move on to a sort of more navy blue. For that navy blue, I'm going to be starting with a base coat of Cantor Blue. And that will also get a wash with some Drakenhof Nightshade. Moving back to the first blue, I'm going to relayer the Macragge Blue just to brighten things up a bit, but of course we're going to avoid any of those recesses. I'll then use a 50-50 mix of Macragge Blue and Calgar Blue for the first set of highlights. And then lastly, an edge highlight of Calgar Blue just by itself. For the red, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Mephiston Red and Evil Sun Scarlet. Then Evil Sun Scarlet just by itself. And lastly, a 50-50 mix of Evil Sun Scarlet and Wild Rider Red for an edge highlight. For the Cantor Blue, I'm simply going to relayer the Cantor Blue, once again avoiding any of the recesses. And that'll be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Cantor Blue and Atolic Blue. For the Crimson Fists, I'm going to start with a base coat of Screamer Pink. I'll then give that a wash with some Carroburg Crimson. For the Dark Angel shoulder pad, I'm going to be using some Caliban Green. And for the Salamanders, I'm going to be using some Warpstone Glow. Both these greens will then be washed with some Beltan Green. For the Space Wolf shoulder pad, I'm going to start painting the inside first, and for that I'm going to be using some Avalanche Sunset. I'll then wash that with some Reikland Flesh Shade. Then once these washes are dry, we're going to go back to the Crimson Fist, and I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Matte White just to highlight the fist. For the Dark Angels, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Caliban Green and Matte White. This is just a simple edge highlight. And for the Salamander's Green, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Warpstone Glow and Mute Green. Once again, this is just a simple edge highlight. Then going back to the yellow, I'm going to relayer the Avalanche Sunset, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. And for the highlight, I'll be using a 50-50 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Flash Gits Yellow. Then for the trim, I'm going to be using some Rust Grey. And that'll be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Rust Grey and Fenrisian Grey. Moving on to the white logos, I'm going to be starting with a base coat of Grey Seer. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and Matte White. And finally, Matte White just by itself. For the plasma weapons, I'm going to start with a base coat of Arithmetic Blue. Now this is going to take a while to dry, so while this dries, I'm going to move on to the bases. Okay. It's up to you how you do your bases, but for me, I'm going to be using some Stirland Mud. Once that's dried, I'm going to give it a dry brush with some Rakarth Flesh. I'll also neaten up the rims with some Abaddon Black. Then to brain up the plasma coils, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Arithmetic Blue and Matte White. I'm then going to use that same mix but a little bit more white for a 70-30 ratio just in the center of the coils. And then lastly, a second coat of Arithmetic Blue just around the very edges of the plasma coils. Finally for me, just to add a little bit of dirt around their shoes, I'm going to use some weathering powder of dark brown just to make it look like they've been stepping in a little bit of mud. I'll then finish off the rest of the bases. There we have it, that's the Deathwatch Kill Team finished. I have to say I had an absolute blast painting these guys, and they're super easy and fairly quick to do, as well as it's mostly just detail work once you get that armor out of the way. In total, they took around about 9 hours to complete for all 10, and as I said, it's an absolute blast painting them. For new painters, these guys may seem overwhelming at first, but trust me, once you get stuck in, you'll be flying along in no time whatsoever. Thank you so much for watching this video. Now, if you use this guide, I really do hope it helped. And if you want to see more, we've got plenty more different paint guides on the channel. So give the channel a subscribe, the video a like, maybe a share, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks again, and goodbye for now.